National in downtown Miami. We continue our live coverage here from the campus of Miami-Dade College, and now joining us on our call-in set here is Eliza Griswold, whose book is The 10th Parallel. Eliza Griswold, what is the 10th parallel?
The 10th parallel is the line of latitude about 700 miles north of the equator. And I spent the past 7 years traveling between the equator and this particular fault line. So I always remember lat is flat. That's from probably third grade. Latitude is horizontal. So traveling within this bandwidth, 9,000 miles from West Africa through Southeast Asia, looking at what happens on the ground when Christianity and Islam actually meet. Because the single fact that I really began with is that 4 out of 5 of the world's 1.3 billion Muslims do not live in the Middle East. They're not Arabs. They're Africans and they're Asians. And they live within this space, and this is where basically the southern edge of the world's Muslims meet nearly half of the world's 2 billion Christians who live in Africa and Southeast Asia. Some people refer to this area as the Global South. It's kind of the new moniker. It's a little bit clunky, but it's certainly better than developing world. And so here, most of the people of faith in the world live, and they meet each other. And so I wanted to see what actually happens on the ground when Christianity and Islam practically meet.
7 years?
7 years.
Why?
Because I can't think of a more important question. I certainly, as a reporter, have heard so much about this overblown and oversimplified clash of civilizations narrative. And I wanted to see what actually happens in floods, in droughts, in fights over land, oil, water, and even in Indonesia, crops of chocolate. Because when the global price of chocolate spiked, cacao, the principal ingredient in chocolate, is grown in eastern Indonesia on an island called Sulawesi, and Christians and Muslims began to fight over that very valuable land. And so I wanted to see what actually happens when resource conflicts are mixed with faith, because it isn't that religion can be explained away by political economy. It isn't always a question of haves and have-nots. And so essentially I wanted to try to restore the reality of this beyond this monolithic, oversimplified clash, which is simply not the truth on the ground.
Why is the price of cacao a religious issue?
That's a good question. The price of cacao is a dividing issue, right? And it's so because essentially what has happened in eastern Indonesia, which is really interesting in terms of, because it dates back hundreds of years. Some of these confrontations and the history of coexistence are hundreds, if not thousands of years old between Christians and Muslims. What happened in eastern Indonesia primarily, the spice trade, the trade winds brought Christian and Muslim traders and missionaries to the same beaches and islands and ports, much as they brought Hindus and Buddhists before them. They came on the wind, and this is where the trade winds drop, essentially. So in the eastern part of the archipelago, Islam arrived first. Islam arrived first throughout what is today's Indonesia, which is more than 24,000 islands. And so the Muslims took up the coast. They were traders, they were sailors, and Islam really rang the coast of many of the places, especially in the eastern part of the archipelago. Well, when the Dutch, first the Portuguese and then the Dutch arrived, what happened really in the 16th century is that the Dutch targeted inland populations where Islam hadn't reached yet on these islands. Why? Because the people who lived inland ate pork, and pork is haram. It's forbidden by Muslims. And so the Dutch missionaries used the naturally pre-existing trends and practices of the people there to graft Christianity onto local conditions. So how does cacao come to bear on this? So the Muslims in this eastern part of Indonesia tend to be wealthier. They have these global trade links because they're on the coast. The Christians who live inland do not have these global links, and they're poor. And so what's happened is the Muslims have bought up a lot of the highland, right? The Christians live inland and they live up on these ridges, and the Muslims have bought a lot of the land, and the Christians are essentially sharecroppers. And like any sharecroppers, that process can make people absolutely outraged, especially when they see the price of their crops going through the roof. And so Christians have been forced to sell off their land to Muslims in that area over the past decades, and that has made people super angry.
Eliza Griswold, are there any generalizations you can make about your travels, about the people you met throughout this 10th parallel?
Well, probably the largest surprise for me is that we talk a lot about the clashes between religions, but the most important religious confrontations of our time are not those between Christianity and Islam. They're those inside of Christianity and Islam. They are the confrontations between Christians and Christians, Muslims and Muslims, over who's a true believer and who's not, who has the right to speak for God and who doesn't. We certainly see that here in America when people, we'll just take, for example, we see that between liberals and conservatives, when people like Reverend Franklin Graham, head of a $500 million evangelical empire, and Billy Graham's son, questions whether President Barack Obama, a member of the United Church of Christ, is a true Christian or not. What's that about? That's about this confrontation inside of Christianity. And within Islam, it's even more important to understand that there is no such single thing as Islam. There are thousands of Islams. This isn't only a sectarian division between Sufis, Sunnis, and Shia. It's also a question between liberals and conservatives over who's going to control what Islam means in the 21st century in practical terms, whether it's veiling or practices for women's rights or economic policies. These are confrontations within the religions, and they are the most important confrontations of our time.
What's your relationship with Franklin Graham?
My relationship with Franklin Graham, I'm glad to say, is a very friendly one. I have a great deal of respect for him. He's also good fun. We traveled together in 2003 to Sudan when he was going for the first time in history to meet with a man he had called just as evil as Saddam Hussein. And that man is still Sudan's president today, President Omar Hassan al-Bashir. He stands indicted by the Bashir stands indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity for what happened in Darfur. So in 2003, Darfur was just really a whisper. And at that time, Franklin Graham was very much in the public eye because he had called Islam a wicked and evil religion. And so that soundbite was echoing around, especially in Sudan, because the north of Sudan is primarily Muslim. And so there was a lot of outcry against his arrival. And so when I found out he was going to meet with his sworn enemy, I asked if I could go along, and I was working for that bastion of religious values, Vanity Fair magazine. And so he said yes, and he took me. And when we went and sat in the Marble Palace, these two men, it was like watching, it was fascinating. So these two men each tried to convert the other, and that was not terribly successful. And then Graham made reference to a hospital that he ran until very recently in Louis, the South Sudan's largest hospital. And President Bashir's government and his army has actually twice bombed this hospital. That's how Sudan's 40 years of civil war have played out on the ground, that especially Bashir has really bombed feeding stations, bombed hospitals in the South. And Graham has seen that up front, which is what really shapes his opinions about Islam, which he holds to this day. So Graham said, Mr. President Bashir, I have a hospital in the South. And Bashir said the one and only sentence he uttered in English during the whole time, which is to his aide. He turned to his aide and said, isn't that the hospital we bombed? And Graham leaned forward and said, twice, and you missed. And with that, most of us were ushered out into the driveway. And what happened next was even more fascinating. Graham told me later that he remembered that in the pocket of his blue blazer, he had a George W. Bush 2004 re-election pin, which he'd taken from the desk of Karl Rove's secretary. And so he leaned forward and took the pin from his pocket and gave it to Bashir and said, Mr. President, I understand you'll be speaking to my president later today. Why don't you tell him you're his first voter here in the Sudan? So what does that mean? Essentially, Bashir, I've got the ear of the president, and I found that particularly interesting at the time because of the relationship between faith and foreign policy, which goes so unexplored because we don't really know who are serving as our de facto ambassadors abroad a lot. Now, of course, that meeting would be impossible given Bashir's record on human rights. But for me at the time, it was just fascinating. It was like watching history books come alive.
Poet and investigative journalist Eliza Griswold is our guest. This is her first nonfiction book, The 10th Parallel. 202 is the area code if you'd like to call in and talk with her. 585-3885 for those of you in the East and Central time zones. 585-3886 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. First call up for Eliza Griswold comes from Portland, Oregon. Please go ahead, Portland.
Hello, everybody. I really appreciate Slen and the author for enriching in so many dimensions the talk, especially nowadays that the world has become a world village. I have a couple of questions in regards to what kind of economic holes she perceives in the book or she exposes in the book, not only in regards to petroleum, but I think that it's very acute the fact that she points out that a lot of the economy that comes from that parallel down in the hemisphere, it's related to cacao and other crops. And my question, I guess, is do you know of any companies that are doing business currently that profit from that cacao economy? So that is it. Thank you.
So a lot of the local businesses, the cacao businesses in Indonesia they have local elements and they have international elements. I mean, cacao was just one and really one of the smaller resources that I was looking at and the crops that I was looking at in the course of the 7 years of reporting. Much more certainly relevant on a world scale today would be oil. Because Sudan, for example, is a huge oil supplier, but not to the United States, right? So one thing that I was seeing quite a bit of in Africa especially was Chinese oil development. And you know what? I was also seeing Malaysian oil development in Sudan. And I had a very curious conversation along the 10th parallel in an oil field called Heglig, which we're going to be hearing more about in Sudan because southern Sudan, which has had an intermittent 40-year civil war with northern Sudan, which has led to the death of 2 million people. Southern Sudan on January 9th of 2011, so very soon, is going to be voting for its right to its own independence. Now, 80% of Sudan's oil is in the south of the country. But there's only one way that oil leaves the country, and that's through the north. That's through a pipeline. And that pipeline is heavily protected by Chinese oil interests. Now, it used to be U.S. companies, which have divested because of so much political power. And I had a very curious conversation with some of the former farmers, Sudanese southern farmers, who have been essentially scorched earth shoved off their land by oil interests, right? So they are now essentially fishermen and they fish in puddles. And I had a group of men say to me, why can't you bring back Chevron? We much prefer Chevron and Western oil interests to Chinese ones because at least they try to get to know us. So, you know, that is to say in shorthand that what looks at a distant, like dismal economic policy and we should bring sanctions and we need to stay out of particular areas is frequently on the ground much more complicated than it looks at a distance.
Redding, California, good afternoon to you. You're on with Eliza Griswold.
Hi, I just wanted to thank this lady for her statement about so much of the conflict that's flamed between Christians and Muslims is really between their own kind, Muslims against Muslims and Christians against Christians. I think that was a very profound insight that's not recognized. I'd also like to ask her if she knows of any third party that's interested in conflicts between Christians and Muslims, and if she could expound on that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Like a third party, a political party, or?
I think he meant generically.
Okay,
if there's
so
anything that you recognize as a third party, be it a corporation, be it whatever.
sure. So I will just be totally frank. I'm the daughter of a priest, and so I grew up watching a lot of interfaith dialogue that frankly put me to sleep.
Episcopalian priest.
Episcopalian priest, exactly. Just to clarify, Episcopalian priests can have children. So I grew up in a household where questions of faith and intellect were daily questions, and seeing a lot of what does it mean when Christians and Muslims and Jews and Buddhists or Hindus, whoever it is, sit down and try to find common ground. And a lot of that, I'll be frank, was a lot of hot air. There are so many places along the 10th parallel where I've seen substantive interfaith work really being done by people themselves. They don't need a third party. In fact, sometimes they're better served without one. So in Nigeria, for example, there is a pastor and an imam who are both self-avowed fundamentalists. They both believe the other one is going to hell no matter what.
Is that James and Ashafa?
Yes, it's James and Ashafa. And so James, who's the pastor, has one arm. Why? Because his other arm was lopped off in fighting between the two men about 15 years ago. And so these guys have done the most successful interfaith work that I've seen in practical terms. It's essentially community and organizing 101. They don't deal with garbage collection, but it's like that. They deal with stoves, because one of the things Christians and Muslims fight about in northern Nigeria is firewood. So they get a buy-in from Christian and Muslim women, because the women are much more likely to be amenable to peace. And they say, hey, you guys, it costs $360 to get enough wood every year to burn, to make your food in a single year. This stove costs $100. We can't buy it for you. How are you going to figure out to buy it? So it's bringing in a secular element, really a third element rather than a third party is maybe the best way to say it. I think in most situations, people are better off building peace on their own.
Dispatches from the fault line between Christianity and Islam is the subtitle. Next call for Ms. Griswold comes from Belfast, Maine.
Yes. Good afternoon. I'm curious whether the author has an idea of, from the places she's traveled, how the two different religions discussed how they might or might not be reacting to the controversy of the Islamic Center proposed for Manhattan.
Thank you, caller.
That gets to a super important point, which is that global realities can lead to deaths in many places that I traveled along the 10th parallel. In particular, the Danish cartoon riots left more people dead in Nigeria than in any other country.
Why?
Why? Because, well, for one, we're looking at weak states, really failed states that are weak at best, right? And so local identities tend to be based not around. If you ask someone, who are you? The answer isn't, I'm a Nigerian. It's I'm a Christian or I'm a Muslim. Why? Because being a Christian or a Muslim is what guarantees that you get electricity, fresh water, a good road. When there is no functioning government, people turn to other factors in order to safeguard those most basic human rights. And along the 10th parallel, people turn to religion quite a lot. So essentially what happens is, I have to say I forgot the question.
It was about the Muslim Center in New York City.
Okay.
But it was a very good answer.
Thank you. So essentially what happens is, Pastor James Ashafa said something to me which I really repeat all the time, which is when the West sneezes, Africa and Asia catch the colds. So when something, again, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, the lunatic holding up the Quran and saying he was going to burn it. These images rocket around the world, and people do die. People die in Kabul. They die in Nigeria. And so in terms of the ground zero question, because it has not turned explicitly violent here, I have not seen that leading to a lot of violence elsewhere that along the 10th parallel. That said, these two sides shape each other. Radicals on one side mouth off and they create an equal and opposite reaction on the other side. And that is what is so innately polarizing within each community. Because somebody stands up and says, hey, this is what it is to be a true believer. I am a true exclusive believer. And that creates fissures in the same side and creates fear across that fault line.
How prevalent is Sharia law?
Well, in Nigeria, we'll just stick in Nigeria for a second. So 12 of 36 Nigerian states, so basically the northernmost third of Nigeria, follow Sharia law. So they follow Islamic law. So what does that mean in practical terms? That means it has proven to mean very little. Essentially, the call to the return to Islamic law is so frequently in this area of the world about rejecting corruption, rejecting what's seen as the failed democracy imposed by the West, which is curious to us. We don't think of that. We think, well, it's about the hudud, it's about the criminal code that says lop off hands, stone people to death. In fact, not. In fact, the first religious edict we have about stoning unbelievers to death comes from the book of Deuteronomy. It comes from the Old Testament, or one of the Pentateuch. Yeah, it comes from one of our older scriptures, not from Islam. So Sharia is present in the northernmost third of Nigeria, and curiously enough, probably one of the most interesting places I've ever seen it practiced, and one of the most interesting pieces of the book, is what happened in Indonesia after the tsunami, where in the province of Aceh, the Achenese people decided to adopt Sharia. And the book tells the story of going out one Saturday night on a raid with the Vice and Virtue Squad, which was like Taliban meets Keystone Cops, essentially.
Next call for Eliza Griswold comes from Orlando. Go ahead, Orlando.
Yes, thank you for your work. My question is, do you believe that these differences in religion are really a cover for grab for political power? Thank you.
You know, the answer to that is a complicated one, because a lot of the work that I have done and that is essential we understand, I never found myself in a place where I could explain away somebody's belief in God. Really, the job of this book was to bring back people's stories whole cloth, right? There was no objective truth to saying, oh, this is just about politics, or this. And there were certainly situations in which you could see people's political interests and what was playing out on the ground, and how they used religion as a mask. But I would say that would be 1 time out of 10. 9 times out of 10, there was a faith factor. There was a fault line there that had to do with people's beliefs about God. And a lot of the book is about restoring that, just as people told me themselves.
Eliza Griswold, how did you shop a book called The 10th Parallel?
So, with some difficulty. So, as a freelance journalist, you know, I became a freelance journalist in 2000, really, and my first story was about honor crimes. It was about women who are killed by their families for perceived infractions against their honor, usually around sex, being raped, adultery. So that was right before 9/11, and I ended up in New York on 9/11 like so many young reporters, and 2 weeks later I was in Pakistan with that dust from the World Trade Centers on my shoes. And I was wearing, I was one of throngs, you know, who had that same experience. And most of us really haven't looked back. And so I came of age at a particular time where trying to understand religion was very much, there was a market for it, essentially. And so thanks to be honest, it's my wonderful editor, Jonathan Galassi and Paul Eli at FSG, who really decided they would take on this cuckoo project and allow me a very long leash that might take several years longer than anticipated, which in fact it did. So.
Next call for our guest comes from East Hampton, New York. Good afternoon to you.
Hi, thanks. I have I guess a sort of book fair type question. I've been following Ms. Griswold's poetry for some years, and it's extraordinary work. It's classical with poetry. It's very deep, highly symbolic, conceptual, intellectual, moving, and you don't expect that sort of thing from journalists. So I'm wondering, maybe part of the question is answered in her own biography, whether being the daughter of a priest sort of predisposed her for a literary life, and that moving from literature to journalism provided an opportunity to get into prose, but that the great poetry book that's come out is a kind of return to origin. So that's sort of the first part of the question, if there's a distinctly literary background, which might be related to religious life, to the poetry. And then secondly, people who see what you see around the world, tremendous pain, injustice, depravity, most of them, I think, need some sort of vent for that. And I'm wondering whether you think your poetry operates as a vent, or it may be somewhat therapeutic for you, because I wonder whether human beings can really absorb the kinds of things that you and Samantha Power see, for example, around the world, and then seem to come back and have a tremendous balance, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, caller. Eliza Griswold.
Well, thank you very much. So yes, mostly I write poetry about what I don't understand. That's really it. I mean, so if that is while I'm reporting a story and I see something or I meet somebody and I can't figure it out on the page in prose, that stuff usually goes to poetry. And for me, there is something that is, to be honest, that's my religion in a certain way, that this idea of, there's a theologian, a Romanian theologian, Mircea Eliade, who writes about something called the hierophany, the space where the horizontal and the vertical world, the secular and the sacred meet, and that is the creation of ceremonial space. And that's what I write. That for me, when I can kind of feel that heat around something, that usually becomes a poem. And I do have a new book of poems that will be out no time soon, but I'm working on it right now.
So he obviously bought Wide Awake Field.
That was Wide Awake Field, and I do hope he bought it. And some of the answers, I hope, biographically. The 10th Parallel is not at all a first-person narrative. This is a story about Africans and Asians. But one thing I've definitely learned is, in this kind of work, there's no such thing as objectivity. The best I could do was continually own my own subjectivity, and poetry obviously allows one to constantly be honest about the lens through which one is looking.
Where did you go to college?
I went to Princeton University.
Why?
Why? Well, at the time, because the creative writing department there was extraordinarily strong, and I grew up in Philadelphia, which isn't so far. And weirdly enough, I missed the light. There's a kind of light in Delaware, New Jersey, and Philadelphia, this kind of low slant of light that is not anywhere else. But yes, we will leave it there.
Next call for Eliza Griswold, whose book is The 10th Parallel, Dispatches from the Fault Line Between Christianity and Islam, Milwaukee. Good afternoon to you.
Hello, I'm on the air? Okay.
You are, sir.
Hello. I didn't hear you mention, Ms. Griswold, the fault line within the Islamic world on the ethnic basis. So you did mention that the majority of Muslims are not Arabs, but in the Sudan specifically, the fault line between the Darfur Muslim non-Arabs and the central government, which is Arab, and the fact that the non-Muslims of the South have for many years emphasized that the Darfur issue, like the Bezas and the Nubas and the other smaller Muslim Northerners, together form a majority of black Africans, which together Muslim non-Arabs with non-Muslim Southerners form a huge two-thirds majority, and that the Darfur issue is essentially racial, because the Muslim non-Arabs of the Darfur are being marginalized, much like the Southerners, which is what a man who just died, John Garang, was kind of like the hero of the whole black majority movement, and that they considered a sort of an apartheid, and that the Zanzibar Revolution was very similar, and that the whole killing of these
Okay,
blacks...
caller?
Yes.
Caller, we got the point. Let's get an answer from Ms. Griswold.
Okay, so great point. The larger thing to understand about, again, we're talking about Sudan, Africa's largest country. This is how all of Sudan's wars relate, whether it's Darfur, whether it's the South, whether it's the Beja people in the East, whether it's even the Northerners, the Nubians. The central cabal based in Khartoum, this very small political, very powerful regime fights against its own peripheries, wherever those peripheries are, against any terms they may be. In the south, traditionally, they've used Islam. Sudan waged the modern world's bloodiest jihad against Christians and Muslims alike in its own country. You're right, Darfur is Muslim. These are the kind of nuances which are essential to understand to try to decode some of this. Oh, it's Christian Muslim all the time. No, it's not. It's the fault lines within that are truly the most important to watch.
We haven't talked about Ethiopia or Djibouti.
Okay. Ethiopia. So my most favorite story that I learned in doing this book was I didn't go to Ethiopia until very late in the reporting. And before I went, I learned that in 615 AD, when the Prophet Muhammad was a 40-something rich trader preaching to his own people, the Quraysh, in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, they kicked him out. They didn't want to hear this message of one single God, and he fled with most of his followers 210 miles away to Yathrib, now known as Medina, the city of the Prophet. At that same time, 615 AD, Islam wasn't really a religion yet. He sent a dozen of his followers to Africa. Why? Because he wanted them in the safest place he could think of, and that was the court of a Christian king. That was the king of Ethiopia. Then it was called Abyssinia. And his own daughter, Rukia, was one of these 12, right? So they go to the court of the Christian king, and this is one of the earliest cases of political asylum we have in history. And they say to the king, they tell the king a story to try to safeguard their passage. They tell him the story of the Virgin Mary giving birth to the baby Jesus, which is a story in the Quran. And the king is a bit mystified, doesn't really understand who these people are, but gives them land in a place called Nagash, north of the capital of Addis Ababa. Not the capital at the time, but that's where it is, Nagash. I was there a few months ago. The followers of those first descendants are still there. So this story of coexistence between Christianity and Islam is long and it's powerful. And it's important to remember, not in some kind of mealy-mouthed, we all believe the same thing, but in understanding how these two religions have shaped each other since they began.
Tallahassee, good afternoon.
Hello, this is Mario from Tallahassee. Can you hear me?
We're listening, Mario.
I wanted to ask about the conflict between the Muslims and it's Muslims and the Christians under the occupation of Israel. It's a brutal occupation.
Eliza Griswold, does the Middle East issue play out on the 10th parallel?
Not at all. In fact, the point, does it play out? It does, in that same global reality, right? In the same way the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, in the same way a Ku Klux wanting to burn the Quran, yes. Globalization brings this issue to bear, very much so. And, for example, I mentioned this town where the pastor and the imam live. It's called Kaduna, which means crocodile. It's in northern Nigeria. A river runs down the middle of it. Now, one side of that river has Christian neighborhoods, the other Muslim. The Muslim neighborhoods are called Baghdad and Afghanistan. The Christian neighborhoods are called Haifa, Jerusalem, and inexplicably, Tel Aviv. A reporter from a Jewish magazine asked me the other day if maybe they'd misunderstood Tel Aviv, but I don't think so. So global reality, this is globalization. Does Israel-Palestine play out there? In those names alone, you can see that the Christian community in Nigeria and in other places very strongly identifies with the Israelis. Of course, you're going to see much of that within the Muslim context, too. Sometimes, though, it's an excuse. I mean, Osama bin Laden, we know, came to the issue of Israel-Palestine late in his 1998 fatwa. It wasn't an issue for him before that. In the same way, sometimes Israel-Palestine can be a political football for people trying to garner their own local interests.
Petite, blonde American woman along the 10th parallel. What was that like?
It was dirty little secret. It's easier to be a woman and do this reporting than it is to be a man.
Why?
Because most violence is random. And so if somebody comes up to your car with their AK-47 and they have malintent and they look in and there's a woman, you get 15 seconds of grace period. a little bit of shock goes a long way. That doesn't mean that many of my female colleagues haven't been horrifically mistreated, but kidnapping a woman is expensive. It's ethically and religiously suspect. You need a woman to watch her, you need a separate space. And so in those small ways, which are really the most important ways doing these kind of reporting, I was given some safety.
Did somebody walk up to your car with an AK-47?
There is an episode, someone strafed the car with, yes, automatic fire in Somalia. There were definitely, in fact, there was an episode that I was attacked by something called the Nigerian Taliban in northern Nigeria. I don't write about it in the book because the book is not about like hot zone rah-rah. The book is about Africans and Asians. But there's plenty of that if somebody wants to read a little. There, you know, I was also in some very bad shelling in Somalia. But when we hear these statistics, I mean, Somalia, for example, is the most dangerous place on earth for journalists. The reality is that statistic means local journalists. Everywhere I went, I worked with local people. And it's those people who end up paying the price should I do something wrong.
What's the takeaway on this book? What do you want people to take away on this book?
I really want people to take away the idea that it is this clash within that we have to pay attention to. I want them to take a little hot air out of this overly simplified narrative because it does no one any good, and that kind of martial rhetoric can actually lead to people dying.
Eliza Griswold, 10th Parallel, first-time guest on Book TV. Thank you for being with us here in Miami.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we've got another call-in opportunity, and then Jonathan Franzen will be presenting his book, Freedom, the one President Obama picked up this summer and read while on vacation. He'll be doing that in the Chapman Auditorium. But first, up next, we're going to learn about Robert Morris.
You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2.